Midnight in Paris, undoubtedly the best film ever made. It's a 2011 movie by Woody Allen and won both the Oscar and Golden Globe for Best Screenplay. It is set in the Paris of today and that of the 20s, and it plays a lot with your feelings. There is so much detail to the film that I might as well just make a 2-hour-long video mentioning all the fun details and stories, but for now it has to be a best of. Spoiler alert, if you haven't watched the movie yet, you should, because I'm totally going to describe the whole thing in this video. The film starts with a collection of shots from Paris. Here you can already notice that the colors in this film are shifted into the orange and green tones, which tries to express the romantic idea that is associated with Paris. Most places have a certain color attached to them in movies, like America has neutral colors, Mexico and India red colors, Germany and Scandinavia blue, and so on, and Paris has this orange color grade. Interestingly though, much of the rest of France has blue and neutral colors, which I guess is because the idea of France is not as romantic as the idea of Paris. Speaking of romantic ideas, in the background plays Si tu vois ma mère by Sidney Bechet, with the main instrument in this song being the soprano saxophone. The actual story itself begins with Jill and his fiancée Ines standing in Monet's water garden. Jill is a Los Angeles scriptwriter who is currently struggling to write a book and dreams of moving to Paris to pursue his writing there. Ines is totally not supportive and just wants a house in Santa Monica. Let me just spoil you the entire movie here. These two are really not supposed to be together. They just don't get along. Problem being that Jill is about to get married to Ines, which means that it would be pretty painful to admit to oneself that it's just not supposed to happen. Because of this, Jill suffers from cognitive dissonance, meaning that he holds two contrary beliefs. 1. Not loving Ines, and 2. Getting married to her. Admitting to oneself that this one is true would be too painful, and thus it gets repressed. This causes Jill to feel unhappy with his present, which lets him want to escape to the 20s. The entire rest of the movie is essentially just him solving his internal conflict. It is the classic hero's journey to self-knowledge. Jill and Ines travel back to Paris, dinner with Ines' parents, trip to Versailles. They take a tour with the tour guide being played by Carla Bruni Sarkozy, who was at the time when the movie was made the first lady of France. Wine tasting on the roof of a suite, which starts around 15,000 euros a night, and when leaving, Ines decides to go dancing with her friends, whereas Jill decides to go for a walk alone in Paris. I know it is kind of random here, but if any of you ever has the chance to go dancing, and I mean like social dancing, do it. It is amazing. Not trying to flex here, but I am my school's second ball king. And that's about it with my life achievements. Jill takes a walk that should take him at least 1 hour and 2 minutes, and he sits down under the Église Saint-Étienne-du-Mont, which is, by the way, where the mathematician Blaise Pascal is buried. There, he is picked up by a Renault Type 184 Landaulet, which is kind of a problem because this car is from 1928, and by then, all the cool people had moved out of Paris again, but I'm just nitpicking here. The car drives 6 minutes to the Quai du Bourbon. There, Jill suddenly finds himself on a golden age party. He is suddenly in the 20s and is greeted by Zelda and Scott Fitzgerald, two of the most important figures of the Lost Generation writers. The 20s in Paris are sometimes referred to as les années folles, so the crazy years. It was one of the golden ages of Paris because so much cool stuff was happening back then. There was a blooming literary scene on the left bank of the Seine, which is where a lot of the American expats lived, including Hemingway, Fitzgerald, Gertrude Stein, and many more. This is where the Lost Generation literature came to be. On the right bank of the Seine, and especially in Montmartre, there was a blooming scene of artists, and with people like Dali and Picasso, Paris quickly became the world capital of art. In 1925, there was the International Exhibition of Decorative Arts, which was the peak of the Art Deco style. There was also a huge American cultural influence, but first back to the film. They chat for some time, and together with Cole Porter and the boys, they go to something called a bal nègre. Initially, I was just interested in the role of black people in the 20s, because, you know, the early 20th century wasn't the most tolerant time, but it actually led me down a rabbit hole. Not only was Paris fairly tolerant towards black people, they actually had an obsession with African culture, and even more so, like I just said, American black culture. There's even a word for it, negrophilie. It was a term used by avant-garde artists to describe their passion for black culture. This here is Josephine Baker, who is actually kind of the icon of the année folle, and the more you learn about her, the more you love her. The song that is playing right now is called La Conga Blicoti, which doesn't actually mean anything in French, and it is sung by her. She was born in Missouri, but had her breakthrough in France as an erotic dancer. And not only was she perhaps the most famous person in Paris at the time, she also had her own cafe, was a spy in World War II, entertained Allied troops and the French resistance, was the first international movie star of color, and adopted a shit ton of children. Long before Angelina and Brad Pitt made it cool to adopt children from all over the world, she adopted 12 children from Japan, Korea, Canada, France, Finland, Colombia, Venezuela, Algeria, Morocco, and the Côte d'Ivoire. She called them the Rainbow Tribe, and as if that was not cool enough, she raised them in a 15th century French chateau. Later, she was made a knight in the French Legion of Honor and was the only female speaker at the March on Washington. The same March on Washington where Forrest Gump spoke. Good job there. Anyway, Scott, Zelda and Jill leave for the Restaurant Polydor, which was actually often visited by them in real life and still stands today. They meet Hemingway there.
Hemingway?
He thought he didn't need a babysitter because the cat would look after his baby. He and Fitzgerald had a weird relationship. For one, Hemingway greatly admired Fitzgerald's talent, saying that the writing just came out of him effortlessly. But he also thought that Scott's relationship with Zelda was toxic and slowly killing him. He was very right with that.
Can we not discuss my personal life in public?
One time, Zelda became so possessive of Scott that she told him that his thing was too short and that he couldn't get it on with anyone else. So Scott asked Hemingway if he could measure his thing, and Hemingway said that the length is fine. When Scott still didn't believe him, Hemingway took him to the Louvre to look at the statues, which, I don't know, might not have helped. Hemingway offers Jill to give the first draft of the book he's trying to write to Gertrude Stein for a proofread. Jill goes back to the hotel, where his room by the way costs 2,500 euros a night, and the day passes. The next day, Jill and Hemingway visit the Rue de Fleury-Vingt-Sept, and there they meet Gertrude Stein. She was an American novelist and passionate art collector. Born in Pennsylvania in 1874, she moved to Paris in 1903. Hemingway described her as looking like a North Italian peasant, which kind of makes sense considering that she herself said that she'd rather spend all her money on paintings than on clothing. Also, she's homosexual, which allowed her to become one of Picasso's only female friends because he was a notorious sexaholic and couldn't be long-term friends with any heterosexual woman. Anyway, you know how the generation that came of age during the First World War is sometimes called the Lost Generation? This here is the book that coined the term. Written by Hemingway in 1926, it's a story about people on vacation in Spain and bullfighting. It is sometimes hard to decipher, but the overall theme is that the characters have lost all their values in the First World War. It opens with these two quotes. The first one is, "You are all a lost generation" by Gertrude Stein. She said it to Hemingway in conversation when talking about how the youth of today had lost all its morals, but she herself got it when she was at a car repair shop in Paris. The young mechanic there was too incompetent to fix her car, so his boss said to him, "Vous êtes une génération perdue." So, you are a lost generation. And he meant it in the sense that old people have always used that kind of expression. As in, it is always the younger generation that is the effed up one. But for Hemingway, it fitted so nicely and perfectly described his generation that he used it as an introduction for his book. But to make this kind of very old man sounding rant a bit more eternal sounding, he combined it with a quote from the Bible. Or to be more exact, from the book of Ecclesiastes. "One generation passeth away, and another generation cometh, but the earth abideth forever." This part of the Bible is sometimes said to be the question to which the Bible gives the answers. It is essentially a complaint about how meaningless life is and how existence is nothing but hardship. Very good read, even as a non-Christian. Gertrude Stein and Picasso talk about a painting of his fictional mistress Adriana, which in real life is called La Baigneuse. This here is Adriana. She is played by the French actress Marion Cotillard, who, like Josephine Baker, is also in the Légion d'honneur. Sadly for me though, she's married. In many ways, Adriana is the epitome of coolness in the 20s. This is a chart of what's been cool over time. And right in the 20s there were the flappers. She is one of them. Flappers were in many ways the first wave of emancipated women. They had bob cuts, wore short dresses, listened to jazz and just behaved like rebels, as in treating sex casually, smoking, drinking and just being independent. In general, dresses back then were pretty short, which makes sense because you needed to have a lot of free space when dancing the Charleston. This is the Charleston, and it's just one more aspect of the necrophilia I've talked about before, because the Charleston comes from Charleston, South Carolina, which was once considered the capital of slavery. The dance itself comes from the African-American slave culture and has its origins in Ghana and the Côte d'Ivoire. It looks pretty ridiculous, but that is kind of the point in the Charleston. Nobody takes themselves seriously. If you want to try it, here are some tutorials. It's not even that hard, you just have to be brave enough to do it in public.
Hoping that appetit, Adriana. Isn't this little Parisian dream a movable feast?
Hemingway called Paris a movable feast because having lived there as a young man left you with such good memories that the good times always stayed with you. A movable feast is a holiday that can be moved around the dates of the year, so the connection is there but a little forced.
Between Belmonte and myself, whom would you choose?
Vous êtes tous les deux parfaits.
This guy here is Juan Belmonte, a long-term friend of Hemingway. He was a Spanish bullfighter who revolutionized his craft. You know how bullfighters kind of stand still and the ball goes around them? This guy invented this kind of bullfighting because he was born with slightly deformed legs, and so he had to stand his ground. Before him, bullfighters just used to jump around the bull like circus performers. Hemingway killed himself in 1961, and it is rumored that he was the inspiration for Belmonte to do the same in 1962.
Artists are like children.
Yada yada, extreme cuteness that melts your heart, and some more film that I have to skip over because there's too much to talk about.
With one tear.
Jill and Adriana have a second date,
Look.
and they are picked up by a carriage that warps them back in time into the Belle Époque, which was the period between 1871 and 1914, and they meet some more artists there, namely Toulouse-Lautrec, Edgar Degas and Paul Gauguin. Lautrec's disabilities are sometimes attributed to inbreeding, and yes, he was from a French noble family. The film quickly comes to an end when Adriana tells Jill that she wishes to stay in the Belle Époque.
Let's never go back to the 20s.
This causes Jill to have a revelation. He realizes that shifting time periods is not the solution to finding happiness, and he heartbrokenly leaves Adriana and travels back to the 20s.
Goodbye, Jill.
There, Gertrude Stein tells Jill that Hemingway noticed in the draft of his book that it feels like the main character is being cheated on but does not realize it. Jill then travels back to the present, finds out that he's actually being cheated on, and thanks to that, he can finally break his cognitive dissonance, realizing that he does not want to marry Inez. In the classic hero's journey, the story ends with freedom to live, meaning that the hero has finally become a master of both worlds and has found his peace and place in his own world. Jill does so when he finally finds true love in Paris in the rain.
No, but that's okay. I don't mind getting wet.
Here is some good advice. Never go to Paris. The idea of Paris is much better than the actual Paris.